Tuol Sleng was built as a high school, but in April 1976, detainees were moved into its classrooms by the Khmer Rouge. By the time the regime fled Phnom Penh, at least 12,273 people had been detained through Security Office 21, and only a handful survived. How did a place created for education become Cambodia's most notorious prison, and why did its own meticulous records eventually expose the system it was built to serve? The school compound that became Tuol Sleng was built in 1962, during a period when Phnom Penh was expanding as the capital of an independent Cambodia. Its principal secondary school was known as Preah Pania Yat High School and was later called Tuol Svay Pre High School. A smaller institution, Tuol Sleng Primary School, occupied part of the same compound or its immediate surroundings. The names would later become confused because the prison and museum absorbed more than one educational space. In the early 1960s, however, these were ordinary civic buildings arranged around open courtyards and designed for students, teachers, and lessons. 14 years after the compound was built, its classrooms no longer belonged to a functioning city. The decisive transformation began before any cell was constructed or any window was covered with barbed wire. It began with the destruction of the society that had given a school its purpose. Cambodia had tried to remain outside the war-consuming neighboring Vietnam, but that position became increasingly difficult to sustain. Vietnamese communist forces used areas inside Cambodia, American aircraft attacked suspected sanctuaries, and Cambodian politics grew more divided. In March 1970, Prince Norodom Sihanouk was removed while he was abroad. General Lon Nol and his allies established the Khmer Republic, aligned themselves more closely with the United States, and entered a widening civil war against Cambodian communists who became widely known as the Khmer Rouge. The conflict was not created by a single government or military operation. It drew strength from regional war, domestic inequality, political repression, foreign intervention, and the collapse of authority in the countryside. Sihanouk, still respected by many rural Cambodians, called on his supporters to join the movement fighting Lon Nol. American bombing and ground combat devastated communities and displaced families. The Khmer Rouge expanded from a relatively small revolutionary force into an army capable of surrounding the capital. Phnom Penh therefore changed long before it fell. Refugees crowded into the city as government territory contracted. Food and fuel became scarce. Artillery and rockets reached populated districts. By April 1975, the capital contained far more people than it could reliably support, including soldiers, wounded patients, civil servants, merchants, monks, children, and rural families who had already lost their homes. The city was exhausted, but it was still alive. Hospitals treated patients. Markets traded. Families occupied houses. Schools, where possible, still represented a world organized around civilian needs. On April 17, 1975, Khmer Rouge forces entered Phnom Penh. Many residents initially greeted the end of fighting with relief. That relief lasted only hours. Armed cadres ordered the population to leave. Some said the evacuation would last 2 or 3 days. Others warned that American aircraft were about to bomb the city. Residents were given no genuine choice and little time to prepare. The order applied with extraordinary breadth. Hospital patients were pushed on beds, carried by relatives, or forced onto the roads. Elderly people walked in the April heat. Families searched for missing children while armed soldiers directed human columns away from the capital. The chambers that later tried senior Khmer Rouge leaders found that more than 2 million people were driven from Phnom Penh. Many had no clear destination. The sick, the wounded, and the very young faced conditions that the authorities knew could be fatal. This was more than a military precaution. The Khmer Rouge leadership regarded cities as centers of corruption, class privilege, foreign influence, and resistance. Emptying Phnom Penh helped break existing institutions and sort the population into categories controlled by the revolution. Urban residents were sent to rural cooperatives where they would be watched, assigned labor, and judged by their social backgrounds. Homes, offices, hospitals, temples, and schools were separated from the people who had made them function. The legal order disappeared with them. After the Khmer Rouge victory, Cambodia had no functioning system of courts, judges, defense lawyers, or public trials. A later constitution referred to people's courts, but the tribunal that examined the regime found no evidence that such courts were established. Punishment became an administrative decision made inside a secret political hierarchy. Interrogation remained, but the safeguards that might distinguish investigation from coercion were gone. By the summer of 1975, Phnom Penh had become an emptied capital occupied largely by cadres, soldiers, selected workers, and security personnel. The buildings of Priya Ponhia Yat High School still had corridors, balconies, and classrooms. What they had lost was their relationship to pupils, families, and the law. The school did not contain some hidden architectural destiny. It became available for violence because civilian life around it had first been removed, yet thousands of other buildings stood empty in Phnom Penh. Nothing about this particular campus made its later use inevitable. To understand why it was selected, the story must leave the silent school and travel to a small detention center in the Cambodian countryside. There, before the capture of the capital, a former mathematics teacher named Kaing Gwek Eve had already begun developing the methods he would bring to Tuol Sleng. The man who would command Tuol Sleng had once taught mathematics. Kaing Gwek Eve began working at a junior high school in 1965 and was remembered as intelligent and disciplined. Yet he was already moving toward revolutionary politics. He left teaching in 1967, joined the underground Communist Party of Kampuchea, and was arrested by the government in January 1968. Sentenced to 20 years for offenses against state security, he was transferred to the military prison at Prey Sar. There, he later said, he witnessed illegal executions and torture. While imprisoned, he became a full party member and adopted the revolutionary name Dutch. Released after the coup against Prince Norodom Sihanouk, Dutch returned to revolutionary work in April 1970. In July 1971, the party placed him in charge of a rural security center known by the code M13. Located in Khmer Rouge territory in Kampong Speu province, it was created to interrogate people suspected of spying, betrayal, or opposition to the revolution. The surviving site dates principally from 1973 to 1975, but Dutch had directed the organization from its earlier phase. Dutch divided the center into separate sections. In one, some detainees could be re-educated and released. In the section he supervised directly, prisoners were interrogated, tortured, and killed. He recruited guards and interrogators from nearby peasant communities, including young people whose loyalty could be shaped through training. Detainees received too little food and almost no medical care. Some died before their interrogations were complete. Interrogators demanded confessions that could be sent up the political chain. Violence forced prisoners to identify supposed networks of spies and enemies. Dutch later admitted that he suspected much of the resulting information was fabricated. He nevertheless forwarded it to his superiors. When he decided that an interrogation was finished, he ordered the prisoner executed. This pattern of suspicion, coerced confession, reporting, and death became a model. Although crimes at M13 occurred before the period covered by the later tribunal, the court examined the center because the continuity was clear. Dutch carried its methods, policies, and experienced personnel into the security apparatus created after the Khmer Rouge victory. The new institution would be larger, but its essential logic had already been tested. After Phnom Penh fell, responsibility for national security rested with senior party leader Son Sen. On August 15, 1975, he summoned Dutch and In Lorne, known as Nat, to the Phnom Penh railway station. Nat came from Division 703, whose personnel were conducting operations against officials and soldiers of the defeated Khmer Republic. Son Sen instructed them to establish a central institution called Security Office 21. Nat became its first chairman. Dutch served as his deputy and took charge of interrogation. He brought former M13 staff to Phnom Penh and joined them with Nat's personnel. The new office was connected directly to the party leadership and intended to handle people considered especially important enemies, including members of the revolutionary movement itself. Security Office 21 did not begin at the school now known as Tuol Sleng. It became fully operational in October 1975, using houses in Phnom Penh for detention and interrogation. For a time, it occupied the former National Police headquarters near Central Market, then returned to its earlier location. Nat's forces also converted the psychiatric hospital at Tak Mau into a detention center from which prisoners were delivered to Dutch's interrogators. This early geography changes the familiar story. Before a classroom at Tuol Sleng had been divided, Security Office 21 already possessed prisoners, interrogators, reporting procedures, and an execution policy. Dutch supervised roughly 20 interrogators drawn from his former rural staff and Nat's division. He organized documents taken from the defeated government, prepared reports for senior leaders, taught interrogation methods, and transmitted confessions. He permitted torture and knew that detainees were executed when questioning ended. The process developed at M13 had become an office of the new state. In March 1976, Nat was transferred to the military general staff. Dutch replaced him as chairman and secretary of Security Office 21. He later claimed that he had not wanted the position, but he accepted it and exercised authority over the institution. His superiors considered him loyal, and Dutch regarded himself as a more capable interrogator because of his earlier experience. The following month, he decided to move the prisoners into the former Pawnia Yat High School. Sun Sen approved the decision. The tribunal found that the location was chosen to make interrogation easier and escape more difficult. The transfer completed a sequence now recognized by international heritage authorities. M13 was the experimental stage, Security Office 21 became the central prison, and Chu Ung Ek would become its principal execution site. Tuol Sleng was therefore not a school that suddenly invented its own terror. It was the new physical home of a system already assembled under Dutch. When prisoners arrived in April 1976, the campus still looked like a place built for education. The next task was to make every classroom, balcony, corridor, and surrounding house serve a closed world of control. The classrooms were not demolished. Their familiar dimensions were useful. Walls of brick or wood divided some rooms into narrow cells. Iron shackles were fixed to floors or arranged along bars in larger chambers. Windows were covered, corridors were enclosed with wire, and armed guards controlled the perimeter. The school remained recognizable, but every surviving feature was assigned a different purpose. The compound contained several multi-story school buildings arranged around courtyards. During the later trial, they were identified as Buildings A through E. Building A became the principal location for interrogations and for holding certain senior prisoners. On its lower floor, classrooms were divided into larger individual rooms where important detainees could be chained to iron beds. Buildings B, C, and D contained much of the prison population. Ground floor classrooms were cut into small brick cells. Wooden partitions were also used on an upper level. A typical cell measured roughly 0.8 of a meter wide and 2 meters long, about 2.5 feet by 6.5 feet. Other classrooms remained open and held groups of prisoners shackled together along iron bars. Building E supported offices, documentation, and workshops. The prison also used buildings beyond the school walls. Nearby houses became reception rooms, interrogation sites, staff residences, kitchens, medical facilities, mess halls, and offices for Dutch. The operational compound, therefore, extended farther into the neighborhood than the boundaries visitors see at the museum today. Security operated in layers. A guarded inner enclosure surrounded the former school. A second perimeter protected the supporting houses and work areas outside it. Barbed wire blocked openings and enclosed upper corridors. It discouraged escape, but it also reduced the possibility that prisoners could end their own lives by jumping from the upper floors. Suicide threatened the prison's mission because detainees were expected to remain alive until their questioning was complete. The architecture alone could not enforce that mission. The museum estimates that approximately 1,720 people worked for or supported Security Office 21. Several hundred produced food or performed general labor away from the cells. Others formed the internal staff: administrators, guards, interrogators, photographers, record keepers, medical workers, drivers, cooks, and messengers. Not all were present in the school at the same time, but their labor connected the compound to a broader institutional system. Dutch stood at the top of the prison hierarchy. His deputy, Kim Vac, whose name is also rendered Kim Vat and who was known as Hor, managed much of the daily operation. Guards and interrogators received instructions through this chain. Suos Thai supervised administrative and documentation work, including prisoner records and lists. Specialized units received detainees, guarded them, conducted questioning, maintained files, and arranged transportation. Reports moved upward while commands moved downward. This division of labor allowed individuals to see only portions of the process. A photographer could record a face without attending an interrogation. A guard could deliver a prisoner without preparing the final report. A driver could transport detainees after receiving a list. Yet the separation of duties did not make the institution accidental. The units were designed to move each person through the same controlled sequence, and Dutch maintained authority over the whole. Many staff members were young. Dutch continued the practice he had used at M13, recruiting adolescents and young adults whose political biographies were considered reliable. They were trained to obey the party, preserve secrecy, and regard every detainee as an enemy. Professional experience was less important than loyalty and willingness to follow instructions. The training was deliberate. Interrogators learned approved methods and were told when violence could be used. Guards were taught that prisoners must not escape, communicate, or die before their information had been extracted. In later testimony, Dutch acknowledged what this education had done. Young people who had been gentle became cruel and extreme. He did not describe that change as an unforeseeable breakdown. He admitted that he had helped produce it. Historian David Chandler described Security Office 21 as a total institution, a closed world separated from normal social life and governed by its own rules. Secrecy applied to employees as well as prisoners. Staff could not move freely or communicate outside without authorization. Their work, housing, political instruction, and fear of punishment bound them to the organization. Even those who served the prison could eventually fall under suspicion. The result was more than a converted building. Tuol Sleng became a bureaucracy in which architecture confined the body, hierarchy directed the staff, ideology defined the prisoner, and paperwork connected violence to the party center. Its importance did not come solely from the severity of its cells. Many local security centers were brutal. Tuol Sleng was different because its reports traveled directly toward senior leaders, and its procedures were organized to answer their political fears. By 1977, the former school could receive, isolate, question, document, and dispose of people with grim regularity. But confinement was not the institution's most important product. The cells held prisoners only while interrogators prepared something intended to leave the compound. A confession that could be read by the leadership, treated as proof of conspiracy, and used to identify the next group of enemies. When Chum May arrived at Tuol Sleng on October 28, 1978, he entered a well-established procedure. Guards took him first to a reception room. He was photographed, weighed, measured, and questioned about his biography. His clothes and shoes were taken, leaving him in shorts. Then he was blindfolded, handcuffed behind his back, and led to a cell where his legs were shackled. Before his interrogation began, the prison had converted him into a file. The photograph fixed his appearance. The biography recorded his family, education, employment, and movements. A number connected his body to administrative lists. These details gave interrogators a structure through which his identity could be dismantled. Chum May had been a mechanic before the Khmer Rouge victory. After Phnom Penh was evacuated, the regime used his skills to repair vehicles, tractors, and sewing machines. None of that prevented his arrest. At Tuol Sleng, interrogators demanded that he admit serving American and Soviet intelligence organizations. The accusation was false, but innocence was not an answer the institution could accept. For 12 days and nights he was questioned and beaten. Electric current was applied until he lost consciousness, and his toenails were injured with pliers. The purpose was not uncontrolled cruelty. His interrogators repeatedly returned to the same demand. He must explain when he had become an agent who had recruited him and which other people belonged to his network. Pain was used to force a coherent political story from a man who had no such story to tell. Other prisoners entered the same structure. Bu Meng, an artist, was detained with his pregnant wife, Ma Yoan. He was ordered to confess connections with foreign intelligence that he said he did not understand. Van Nath, another artist, later used paintings to reconstruct scenes of confinement and interrogation. Their testimony differs in personal detail, but it describes a system that imposed accusations before it sought explanations. Life in the cells prepared prisoners for questioning. Those held alone were chained to the floor. In the larger rooms, dozens of detainees were fastened to long iron bars, their bodies arranged in alternating directions. They slept on bare surfaces without bedding. Food usually consisted of thin rice gruel or soup served twice a day. Lice, illness, infected wounds, and weakness spread through rooms where sanitation was almost absent. Control extended to minor movements. Prisoners needed permission to sit up, turn over, speak, or relieve themselves. Guards inspected shackles before dawn and annihilations. These conditions deprived detainees of sleep, privacy, health, and the ability to communicate. By the time an interrogation resumed, the cell itself had already weakened resistance. Prison records distinguished between two broad approaches. One was described as political work. It included questioning, persuasion, contradiction, and attempts to make the prisoner accept the interrogator's assumptions. The other approach imposed physical violence. In practice, the boundary depended on the interrogator and instructions from above. Psychological pressure could become torture when the desired confession did not appear. The interrogators were trained to control the violence rather than avoid it. Prisoners were supposed to remain alive and capable of speaking until their confessions were complete. Notes used by the staff instructed them to make a detainee talk without causing premature death or illness. That language reveals the administrative logic of the prison. The body was treated as an instrument from which information had to be extracted. Dutch reviewed important cases, corrected reports, and wrote instructions in the margins. Some annotations demanded further questioning. Others authorized harsher methods even when death was a foreseeable result. He compared statements, requested additional names, and sent selected material to senior leaders. The confession was therefore not a private exchange between one prisoner and one interrogator. It passed through editors, supervisors, and political readers. A finished confession commonly began with childhood and family history, then moved through education and employment before reaching the alleged betrayal. Prisoners were required to place ordinary relationships inside a conspiracy. Friends became accomplices. Colleagues became recruiters. Administrative mistakes became sabotage. Foreign contacts became proof of espionage. When facts did not support the accusation, torture encouraged invention. This is why the surviving confessions must be read with care. They cannot establish that the prisoners committed the crimes they admitted. Statements produced through coercion are unreliable accounts of guilt. Yet the documents remain powerful evidence of something else. Repeated forms, dates, signatures, annotations, prisoner lists, and instructions reveal the organization that produced them. They show who reported to whom, what leaders demanded, and how questioning was connected to execution. The surviving archive contains photographs of more than 5,000 prisoners, together with thousands of biographies, confessions, staff records, and administrative documents. Many portraits have lost their identifying files, leaving faces without confirmed names. Even so, the collection preserves the scale and repetition of the procedure. Each image records a moment when a person was entered into a system whose conclusion had largely been decided. Tuol Sleng did not investigate whether enemies existed. It manufactured narratives proving that they existed everywhere. Torture did not correct uncertainty. It forced prisoners to supply names and events that completed the leadership's assumptions. Each new name could then be treated as independent confirmation, entered onto another list, and followed by another arrest. As suspicion moved inward through the Khmer Rouge, the confession factory began feeding upon the revolution itself. Some people brought to Tuol Sleng had previously worked for the organization that arrested them. They had carried orders, guarded prisoners, managed offices, or served in the Revolutionary Army. Their position offered no lasting protection. Inside a system built on suspicion, access to power could make a person appear more dangerous, not less. Historian David Chandler identified two broad phases in the prison's changing population. From 1975 until about September 1976, repression focused heavily on officials, soldiers, and associates of the defeated Khmer Republic. From late 1976 onward, prisoners increasingly came from within the Communist Party of Kampuchea, its armed forces, ministries, and regional administration. The change was authorized from above. A Central Committee decision dated March 30, 1976, assigned senior party bodies the power to smash enemies both inside and outside the revolutionary ranks. In the language of the regime, smashing frequently meant physical elimination. The decision did not create every arrest, but it provided political authority for a widening search for internal betrayal. High office was no defense. Khoi Thaun, Hu Nim, and Vorn Vet had held important positions in the revolution and the government. Each was eventually accused of treachery and sent to Security Office 21. Their confessions were shaped to show that opposition reached into the leadership itself. The more senior the prisoner, the more names, meetings, and imagined connections interrogators could demand. Dutch did not operate at a distance from the party center. Until late 1977, he reported to Sun Sen, who directed defense and security. When Sun Sen went east to command military operations, Dutch reported to Nuon Chia, the party's deputy secretary. Few administrative layers separated the prison from these leaders. Important confessions, summaries, and requests for action traveled directly between them. This connection turned coerced statements into instruments of policy. When one prisoner named colleagues, superiors, or subordinates, the information could be sent to the relevant unit. People were summoned to Phnom Penh for meetings, reassignment, or study, then arrested. Others were taken by their own commanders and delivered to the prison. A confession created under torture could therefore generate arrests that appeared to confirm the confession. Suspicion extended through families. The regime treated relationships as evidence of shared guilt. A prisoner's spouse could be accused of knowing the conspiracy. Children represented a possible future claim or memory. Coworkers and relatives were detained because of association rather than any act they had committed. The court's revised list identified hundreds of people primarily as relatives of someone else, while many young children were never formally registered. War with Vietnam intensified this logic. As border fighting expanded, party leaders interpreted military failures and regional resistance as proof of Vietnamese infiltration. Cambodian cadres from eastern areas were especially vulnerable. Vietnamese prisoners of war, Vietnamese civilians, and Cambodians accused of sympathy with Vietnam were brought to Tuol Sleng. Their forced confessions were sometimes used for propaganda as well as internal investigation. The East Zone Purge of 1978 brought the process to its largest scale. Senior officials were summoned or seized, followed by military personnel, local cadres, workers, and their families. Southwest Zone forces entered the region to replace units judged unreliable. Some victims may have opposed the leadership, but the prison did not distinguish verifiable resistance from imagined conspiracy. Both led to the same interrogation system. Even Security Office 21 consumed its own staff. Guards, interrogators, and administrators could be implicated by a prisoner, blamed for an error, or associated with a purged unit. Former guard Him Hui recalled watching his colleagues disappear. Only 2 of the 10 guards in his group remained by the end of 1977. He understood that a minor mistake or a name in someone else's confession could place him inside the cells he guarded. The surviving prisoner list demonstrates how far the target had shifted. It records at least 12,273 detainees. 5,609 were identified as members of the Revolutionary Army, and 4,371 as cadres working in government offices. The categories may overlap, but they establish that thousands of prisoners came from the regime's own institutions. The list also includes relatives, former prison staff, women, children, and hundreds of Vietnamese detainees. Even this accounting is incomplete. Some children were not registered. Files disappeared when the prison was abandoned. The revised list omits individuals whose presence is confirmed by photographs, biographies, or testimony, including known survivors and members of Dutch's own extended family. The total is therefore a documented minimum, not a final count. This evidence explains why Tuol Sleng cannot be dismissed as a place where undisciplined guards committed isolated abuses. It was positioned at the center of a political system. Leaders produced suspicions. The prison converted them into confessions. Confessions produced names. Names produced arrests, and the arrival of new prisoners appeared to prove that the original suspicion had been correct. By late 1978, the revolution was arresting its soldiers, officials, technicians, relatives, and jailers. The system had become self-reinforcing, but it was not directionless. Once a prisoner entered Tuol Sleng, a completed confession did not lead to a hearing, a sentence, or release. It placed that person on the next administrative list for a journey out of Phnom Penh toward the execution grounds at Chuang Ek. At first, prisoners were killed and buried within or near the Tuol Sleng compound. Sometime between 1976 and the middle of 1977, Dutch moved the principal execution and burial site to Chuang Ek, about 15 kilometers, or 9 miles, south of central Phnom Penh. The decision was practical and deliberate. Accumulating bodies near the school created a danger of disease and discovery. Chuang Ek offered greater isolation and space for graves. Dutch selected the location, informed his superiors, and later resisted a proposal to move again because abandoned graves might be found. The execution ground was not separate from Security Office 21. It was a branch of the same institution. Transfers usually took place after dark. Guards removed prisoners from their cells according to prepared lists. The detainees were handcuffed and blindfolded, loaded onto trucks, and told they were being moved to a new house. Those too weak to walk were carried. At Chuang Ek, names were checked again. Prisoners waited in a wooden structure before being led individually toward newly dug pits. A small permanent staff guarded the grounds, prepared graves, carried out killings, and buried the bodies. The use of lists linked the last stage to the documentation office at Tuol Sleng. Even at the edge of a grave, the institution required confirmation that the persons delivered was the person scheduled to die. Large operations in 1977 and 1978 sometimes continued for several days. During major purges, prisoners could be executed soon after arrival at Tuol Sleng without a completed interrogation. Orders from the party center could make a confession unnecessary. The machinery built to manufacture information could become a direct channel for mass killing when leaders demanded speed. Not every victim was sent outside the city. Children, former prison employees, and certain important detainees continued to be killed within or near the school compound. Chuang Ek became the principal execution site, but it did not replace death inside Tuol Sleng. This completes the meaning of the prison's intake procedure. A photograph did not begin a term of confinement that might end in release. For ordinary detainees, arrival was effectively a death sentence whose timing depended on interrogation, administrative priorities, and the availability of transport. Choeing Ek was the organized final stage of that sentence. A few prisoners remained alive because their labor was useful. Van Nath could paint portraits of Pol Pot. Bu Meng was also assigned artistic work. Chum Mei could repair machinery. These skills did not win freedom. They delayed death while the prison still needed their hands. The delay became decisive only when the regime itself began to collapse. By late December 1978, Vietnamese forces had launched a major offensive into Cambodia. Khmer Rouge units retreated, communications broke down, and Phnom Penh faced capture. The staff at Security Office 21 began preparing to abandon a prison built around secrecy. Dutch and his subordinates attempted to eliminate those still in custody. Some prisoners were killed in their rooms during the final withdrawal. Approximately 15 detainees who had been working inside the compound were taken away with the fleeing staff. Among the adults who eventually survived were Van Nath, Bu Meng, and Chum Mei. Their useful skills had kept them alive long enough for the advance on Phnom Penh to disrupt the prison's final plans. Their survival did not leave their families intact. Bu Meng's wife, Ma Yoyen, disappeared into the prison system and was killed. Chum Mei encountered his wife and child during the retreat, but both died in subsequent gunfire. Van Nath carried memories that he would later render in paint. Survival meant becoming a witness while living with losses the institution had made almost impossible to document fully. Children were also left behind. Norang Chanfal had been brought to the prison with his mother and younger brother. He saw his mother only once more through the bars of her cell. As shelling approached and guards hurried away, he hid behind clothing and broken furniture, hoping she would return for him. He later searched the buildings, calling for her, and found prisoners lying motionless in rooms. January 6, 1979, Security Office 21 ceased normal operations. The following day, Vietnamese troops and Cambodian forces opposed to Pol Pot entered Phnom Penh. Soldiers found weakened children at the compound, gave them food, and later took them for medical care. Norang Chanfal survived, but his mother did not return. 14 recently killed prisoners were found in rooms in Building A, still chained to iron beds. They were buried in the courtyard where their graves remain. Elsewhere in the compound stood empty cells, abandoned shackles, photography equipment, and rooms filled with paper. The departing staff had killed many witnesses, but they had not completed the destruction of their own records. Photographs, prisoner biographies, interrogation notes, confessions, execution lists, and internal instructions remained behind. Nearly everyone who could describe Tuol Sleng from inside had been murdered, yet the institution had documented its own work with such intensity that the abandoned school could still speak through evidence created by the perpetrators. The next struggle would concern who preserved that evidence, how it was presented, and whether a museum born from war could establish a history the outside world would accept. On January 10, 1979, Vietnamese military cameraman Ho Van Tay entered Tuol Sleng with his colleague Din Phong. They recorded bodies, iron beds, shackles, and rooms abandoned by the fleeing staff. Their images became the earliest visual record of the prison after its collapse. They shaped how the site would be seen, but they were only one layer of evidence. The new People's Republic of Kampuchea moved quickly to preserve the compound. Officials gathered documents, kept cells and instruments in place, and prepared the location for visitors. By 1980, it was operating as both a museum and an archival center. The decision prevented valuable material from disappearing, although the first displays were created in a country still at war. In August 1979, the new government organized the People's Revolutionary Tribunal to try Pol Pot and Ieng Sary in their absence. The museum was prepared in time for members of the Legal Commission and foreign visitors to inspect evidence associated with the regime. Tuol Sleng therefore became a crime scene, a courtroom exhibit, and a political symbol almost simultaneously. The government installed after the Vietnamese intervention needed international recognition. It presented January 1979 as a liberation from mass violence, while its opponents described Vietnam's actions as an invasion. During the Cold War, Democratic Kampuchea, and later a coalition that included the Khmer Rouge, retained Cambodia's seat at the United Nations. Evidence of the former regime's crimes was displayed in Phnom Penh, while international diplomacy continued to treat its representatives as part of Cambodia's recognized political voice. That context encouraged critics to question the museum's purpose. Some argued that Tuol Sleng had been arranged primarily to justify Vietnamese power. The early exhibition used stark methods: victims' skulls, instruments of torture, photographs of bodies, and a map of Cambodia assembled from human remains. These displays established a clear division between the Khmer Rouge and their victims, but offered limited explanation of how the institution had worked. Political use, however, does not establish that the underlying evidence was false. The first visitors were not only foreign diplomats or journalists. Museum estimates record more than 324,000 Cambodian visitors during its first 2 years, compared with slightly more than 21,000 foreigners. Families came looking for people who had vanished. Rows of prisoner portraits sometimes provided the first confirmation that a relative had entered Tuol Sleng. Van Nath's paintings added another kind of record. Working from his own memory and discussions with other survivors, he depicted crowded cells, interrogations, hunger, and killing. The paintings were not photographs, and they were created after the prison fell. Their value came from eyewitness reconstruction. When placed beside surviving rooms, restraints, staff records, and testimony, they helped viewers understand activities that the admission portraits could not show. The portraits also created difficult questions. Many had become separated from their original files, leaving individuals unidentified. Some people shown on the walls had served the Khmer Rouge before being purged. That history did not lessen the crimes committed against them, but it complicated a simple division between innocent civilians and revolutionary perpetrators. A person could have participated in the regime at one moment and become its prisoner later. Early exhibitions rarely had enough context to address that complexity. The display of human remains raised further concerns about dignity, religion, and historical interpretation. Over time, the map of skulls was dismantled. Some remains were buried, while others were retained as forensic evidence. Curators changed parts of the exhibition, yet preserved key rooms and objects. The museum was no longer simply freezing January 1979 in place. It was deciding how a society should remember violence without turning victims into scenery. Independent research expanded what could be known. Historian David Chandler spent years studying more than 1,000 confessions and interviewing former prisoners and staff. The Documentation Center of Cambodia collected documents from government repositories, private holders, and international research projects. Scholars compared handwriting, dates, biographies, telegrams, photographs, and command structures. Former employees identified procedures and superiors. Survivors tested the records against lived experience. This work revealed both strengths and limits. A confession obtained under torture could not prove espionage. A prisoner portrait without an attached biography could not always establish identity. But office forms, annotations, execution lists, and reports from separate collections repeatedly confirmed the institution's organization. Documents discovered at Tuol Sleng also matched material found in other government offices and private buildings. The archive was not a single narrative, accepted without examination. It was a body of evidence tested through comparison. In 2009, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization placed the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum archives on its Memory of the World Register. The recognition reflected the collection's international significance and its unusual completeness as a record of the Khmer Rouge security system. Tuol Sleng became Cambodia's most notorious prison, partly because it had served the party center. It also became notorious because the site, photographs, files, and surviving witnesses made its operations more visible than those of many other security centers. Preservation created historical knowledge, but it did not deliver immediate justice. 20 years passed before Dutch was arrested, and more than 30 years passed before survivors faced him in a court capable of issuing an enforceable judgment. On May 10, 1999, Dutch was arrested. Photographer and journalist Nick Dunlop had located the former prison chief living under another name in western Cambodia. The records Dutch staff had created to condemn prisoners would now be used to examine his own responsibility. Cambodia and the United Nations later established the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia, a special tribunal within the Cambodian judicial system. Dutch became the defendant in its first prosecution, Case 001. The trial brought together the surviving archive, expert research, former staff testimony, and the voices of prisoners who had lived. Van Nath described the cells and the work that kept him alive. Boomeng testified about torture and the loss of his wife. Chummay explained how a mechanic was forced to invent a history of espionage. Decades after leaving Tuol Sleng, he still wept when its name or the subject of torture returned to his mind. Release had ended his confinement, but it had not ended the prison's presence in his life. Dutch acknowledged that he had commanded Security Office 21 and knew its detainees were killed. He also emphasized orders from superiors, the danger of disobedience, and his claim that he had not created party policy. Those arguments identified part of the larger chain of responsibility. They did not erase his choices inside it. The judges found that Dutch had helped design the institution, directed its staff, approved torture, transmitted execution orders, and refined the process moving prisoners from arrest to death. He had authority over daily operations and personally reviewed important interrogations. Senior leaders supplied the policy and the suspected enemies, but Dutch turned those demands into an efficient system. On July 26, 2010, the trial chamber convicted him of crimes against humanity and grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. The conviction covered persecution, extermination, imprisonment, torture, and other inhumane acts, along with crimes against protected civilians and prisoners of war. On February 3, 2012, the Supreme Court chamber increased his sentence to life imprisonment. The legal language requires care. Dutch was not convicted of genocide in Case 001. His judgment concerned crimes against humanity and grave breaches committed through Security Office 21 and its associated sites. Other tribunal proceedings later addressed genocide against Vietnamese and Cham communities. The museum's name reflects Cambodia's broader memory of the Khmer Rouge period, but it should not replace the specific findings in Dutch case. Dutch died in Phnom Penh on September 2, 2020, while serving his life sentence. His death closed the punishment of one individual, not the history preserved at the school. The archive gained importance as conservators stabilized paper, identified photographs, and made records available for research. The collection now contains more than 700,000 pages. Hundreds of thousands have been digitized, reducing the handling of fragile originals and allowing wider access. The museum also preserves prisoner clothing, restraints, photographic materials, paintings, rooms, and some human remains. Together, these sources provide different kinds of evidence. No single object has to carry the entire history. On July 11, 2025, the former M13 prison, Tuol Sleng and Chaweng Ek were inscribed together on the World Heritage List. Their official title is Cambodian Memorial Sites, from centers of repression to places of peace and reflection. The three locations preserve a sequence developed under Dutch: the rural prototype, the central prison, and the principal execution ground. Tuol Sleng remains open in central Phnom Penh under Cambodia's Ministry of Culture and Fine Arts. Its staff maintain exhibitions, conserve archives, record victim identities, and conduct educational programs for Cambodian students. Recognition does not make preservation automatic. Tropical humidity, natural decay, heavy visitation, urban development, and the fragility of paper and buildings continue to threaten the site. The title of this story asks how a high school became Cambodia's most notorious prison. The answer is not contained in the brick cells alone. First, a capital was emptied and its civilian institutions stripped of purpose. Then a party without meaningful judicial limits installed a security system tested at M13. Dutch brought trained personnel, interrogation methods, record-keeping, and an execution policy into an adaptable school compound. Direct links to senior leaders made the prison central to purges that eventually consumed the revolution's own members. Tuol Sleng became the country's best-known prison, not necessarily because it was the largest. It processed enemies considered important by the party center, connected interrogation to Choeing Ek, and left an unusually extensive archive. Its notoriety comes from both the role it performed and the evidence that survived. The campus, built in 1962, cannot return to the school it was before the Khmer Rouge emptied Phnom Penh. Its classrooms now carry responsibilities no architect intended. They preserve the consequences of replacing law with suspicion and education with forced confession. Yet the final transformation is not the one Dutch planned. The regime turned classrooms into places that manufactured false histories. The preserved school now teaches through records that can be compared, questioned, and verified. Tuol Sleng remains a place of death, but its lasting public purpose is evidence. Proof that a system designed to erase its prisoners documented itself, and that documentation allowed the dead to re-enter history.